I don't need to introduce our President Catherine, who's chairing a very distinguished panel of the Vice Chancellors of Sydney, UTS and Western Sydney. So I'll now hand over to Catherine.
Thanks, George. So everybody in this room is really busy, but these three are phenomenally busy. So I am beyond grateful that they've given up their time to spend an hour with us this morning to look at the perspectives from the universities in terms of the engineering crisis and what we can be doing to avert it. We've already said how vital engineers are. Our universities, though, they're world class, as Mary gave us some fabulous statistics on that, and attract some of the brightest talent from around the world to study here. But we're falling short in attracting Australian students in sufficient numbers to enrol. And to my earlier point, it's not just the number of engineers we're going to need, but I want more than that, because I want them on boards and I want them in government. So we actually have to make a surplus of them one way or another. So what are universities able to do? What are they thinking about this? What do they hope to be able to do? And how, together with industry, can they start to turn this ship around? We all know it's a wicked problem. We all know it's not going to happen overnight. But what are the first things we can start doing? And for me, some of the issues that I hope we'll talk about today will include the cultural issues, some of which were brought up already. And what I'm going to ask them to do, they'll each have a few minutes to make some of their own points, but I'm going to have more of a conversation between one another of them, not just me directing the traffic. You've heard my voice enough already today. So I'm going to, since Barney's on the first cab off the rank seat-wise, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Really appreciate having an opportunity to talk about the future of engineering in a very august crowd out there. I see a couple of retired Vice Chancellors. Good to see Peter Lee there, and Annabelle Duncan as well. So, and the Chief Scientist and Engineer, Hughes, at the back of the room. And Mary, of course. I should acknowledge Professor Mary O'Kane, who's leading the Accord. I gather you spoke earlier, Mary. So I will cut out all of the elements I was going to say around the Accord being on the panel, but I might touch on a few elements of it. Look, it is a really interesting time to be discussing from the university perspective the future of engineering education, particularly while we have not just the O'Kane review underway, the Accord, Universities Accord review, but we have three major reviews of education, and I'm sure Mark will talk in more detail, given his role peripheral in a way to one of those reviews, but importantly involved in teacher education. I'm sure we'll touch on that as well. But those three reviews I think are worth reflecting on. Early childhood, schools reform, so the Brennan review of early childhood, the O'Brien review of school reform, and the next generation of Gonski, and then of course the O'Kane review. All coming at the same time, all to be delivered over the course of the next few months to the government. An opportunity for Jason Clare and the Prime Minister to respond next year in what I think we would all anticipate would be a major statement on education, not simply in the context of one election cycle, but a generational response to those reviews. And I think if we talk about a crisis in engineering education, we should be talking about a crisis in education. We had NAPLAN results out that are very, very concerning. Mark's report touching on what we need to do to improve the quality of teacher education in this country, the critical nature of the early years of life, the first 2,000 days. So we shouldn't imagine for a moment that Mary's review and what we might be able to convince the government to invest in terms of higher education in this country is going to turn around a crisis in engineering. It starts a lot earlier than that. One of the, I think, the very positive things the Minister has made clear, and I'm sure Mary mentioned this morning, his very strong emphasis on equity as a theme for this review, but not equity in itself. Equity is an extraordinarily important aspect of the review and what the Minister wants us to focus on. But he wants us to focus on it, as the interim report indicates, in relation to the skills crisis in this country. And the data that's in the interim report, Mary probably touched on, certainly indicates that we're not going to address the skills shortage if we don't improve participation from equity groups in higher education. So you can extrapolate that immediately into the STEM disciplines and into engineering in particular. So we've got to address equity, and you can't address equity in isolation of the 3 reviews. One of the points I wanted to make and to stress, unfortunately, the Jobs Ready Graduates reforms under the previous government have put a lot of pressure on universities that are very heavily involved in lifting equity participation. My university's one in particular, but I know both Sydney and UTS are doing great things in that regard as well. When you're very focused on that, you appreciate the challenges of widening participation in tertiary education. So one of the key elements, I think, to addressing the challenge is we need to be working together as an integrated tertiary education system with TAFE and with universities, reaching deeply into schools to promote involvement in STEM disciplines from a very early age. And our widening participation teams don't just focus on year 10 and 11 students, they're right down in primary school, getting primary school students onto our campuses, getting them into our state-of-the-art laboratories in Western Sydney, our Western IQ, our new neuroscience facility at Westmead's a great example of that. We have schools lining up to bring their students through, and we're particularly encouraging young girls to come through into those facilities as well. So there's a huge amount we need to do. The JRG reforms actually curtailed funding to widening participation. I'm hopeful that the Accord will actually address that in its recommendations. It's certainly touched on already. So number 1 is widening participation, and we shouldn't think of engineering in isolation of bigger challenges facing the country. Secondly, I know the report that came out last year from ATSE was an important contribution to STEM and the future, and I think there are some great recommendations in that. I just want to pick up on a couple of them. One was a national skills taxonomy and the need to get a common language to operate in. I think one of the things that both Mary and I have been impressed with during the Accord process is the work Jobs and Skills Australia are doing around a very complex task of mapping the Australian skills classification into both TAFE vocational training and higher education curricula as a way of getting us a common language to operate in across the tertiary system. I know it might sound like a distant innovation in comparison to the challenges of a crisis in engineering, but it's crucial that we begin to address some of the fundamental reasons why our tertiary system is not operating the way it should. So I think it was a very important recommendation, and I think real progress is being made. I know there are universities piloting things at the moment. Secondly, and this is a challenge I think for engineering in many ways, perhaps less so at the postgrad level when people are specialising in various ways, but we really do need to advance the conversation around our flexible, stackable micro-credentials and how that fits within lifelong learning in engineering education, and perhaps to look at engineering a little more differently in that context. And I think, again, the review talks about lifelong learning from last year, our STEM Future report. I think it's a vital part of that is upskilling and reskilling. There's a role for, I think, a much more systematic and coordinated approach to the way we offer micro-credentials and the way we stack them flexibly into new credentials. So that's a vital part of it. The last point I'll make, that I think is essential to this, apart from reform of the education curriculum, and I know that the new alliance that Western Sydney's part of has been looking at that, and I thank Mark Hoffman, who's here, for all the work he's been doing in that regard. But we need to give better careers guidance. And again, that's something that's been picked up in New South Wales after the Gonski-Shergold report. Mary's advocating it very powerfully through the interim report, and I think we'll see that manifest itself in the final report. We have to get a coordinated national response to quality careers guidance in our schools in a way that doesn't actually take students away from great opportunities in STEM.
Fantastic, thanks, Barney. Vicky,
Thank you, and I think Marty's touched upon a number of those items, but I would just say, really the 3 things: structural, perceptions, and pathways. And these are really the 3 things we need to deal with. Structurally, Barney talked about the whole issue that the structure of the higher education funding model, and particularly for engineering, it's challenging because if I look at preparing the infrastructure that I need to teach the next generation, for example, people in cybersecurity, high-end defense, manufacturing. All those things requires a significant investment in understanding what will we need to teach that next generation. The other issue is, as I said, if we need to double the number of engineers, where are we going to get those in terms of our capacity to educate that number and the ability to fund places for those numbers? And that was brought out very much in the GO8 engineering deans. And, it's the competition with other demands on society around health and other spending measures. It's a balancing act. The perception issue, I think, is really important about building that the number of engineers coming in. So even if we had places, how do we convince a greater diversity, a different broadening out our pool of students who might come into an engineering pathways? And one of the things is that we have, particularly in Australia, often a stereotype vision of what an engineer does. They fluoro with a hard hat, and that diversity of careers for engineers where they need to be not just as engineers and also in every place in society, whether it's in government, whether it's in nonprofits, whether it's in the humanities. When I look at my people doing creative writing, they're going to be encountering ChatGPT and understand how technology is going to change the whole nature of my graduates in fashion. High-tech engineering, high-performance fabrics, So engineers interfacing with a greater parts of a society is really important. And delivering that perception to our high school and also, even down to the primaries to see what an engineer could be and might be is really important. The pathway issue, I think, is really important. We've talked about the issue, especially about mathematics, and that is one of the single big bottlenecks of our pipeline for the engineer, and that's especially true with our low SES students. The gaps, not only in access to high quality teaching, but facilities, but also what we found during COVID was a digital divide, access to the internet, access to digital infrastructure. I had students in Queensland who said they had to drive up the top of a hill, hold up their mobile phones to get a signal to do online learning. We cannot have that kind of gap in order to widen the pool of participation in our for our students who might become engineers. So that pipeline issue is about the amount of work that we might need to upskill both school leavers, but also people who are coming from other industry around the new digital skills and mathematical skills in order for them to participate in an engineering career in the future is going to be very important. That comes back to Barney's commentary about how we systemize our micro-credentials and our stackable credentials. So those are probably the three things, and I think some of your speakers previously have already touched upon that, but I think those are things we have to reflect on, that it is a pillars, and the way that we have tried to address some of them is through very hand-in-glove partnership with industry. We need to have a tripartite relationship between not university, government, but also industry. And industry has played a big contribution to, for example, some of the outreach, but it's been probably fragmented around different disciplines, around different sectors. So having a better interaction with industries, they have buy-in into developing that skills pipeline. When they front up to my door as at the university and say, I want 5,000 more of these people in my industry, I say, well, you need to come to the party and help us, change perceptions, build our pipeline, and help us develop this sort of infrastructure and teaching facilities that will bring them to that industry level or the next horizon of technology that our engineers need. So that's a few of my thoughts.
And yeah, I'd like to explore that later on, that issue of whose job is it anyway? We're asking the universities for your perspectives, but how much actually should we be going back to business and going, this is your problem, you want us to fix it, what are you going to do to help? Mark.
So thanks. Let me just touch on a few of the themes I think we've already canvassed, but just from my perspective, particularly from my previous role running the New South Wales Education Department and then the recent work we've done around initial teacher education, as every day goes by, I'm more and more concerned about the pipeline. And I think one of the great opportunities, as Barney alluded to, is that we've got these 3 reviews underway at the same time, inextricably linked. Jeff Masters runs the Australian Council for Educational Research. I remember Jeff said to me once, never forget, the strongest predictor of a child's level of education attainment on the last day of school is that child's level of education attainment on the first day of school. And it's interesting, I think, as we reflect on where we get the engineers from, we should be aware that the conversation goes all the way back to early childhood education and levels of educational attainment. The gaps in educational outcomes increase every year between the most advantaged and affluent in our schools and the most disadvantaged. And if in fact we are trying to get more students from low SES backgrounds into universities, early childhood education will be part of the answer to that. And the more I look at it, the more I'm worried about the pipeline. We did significant work when I was at the Department of Education around projected teacher shortages through this decade. And we did that in about 2018. And you saw that in 2020 there'd be real pockets of shortages in some subjects, maths and sciences, STEM subjects, and also certain geographies, regional and rural areas, isolated areas. They've always been hard to staff schools and subjects, but by 2025 it was significantly worse. By 2030, very, very significant indeed. And what COVID's done is brought forward that timetable. And so now schools are really struggling to find qualified teachers in subject areas, and not just in hard to staff schools, socioeconomically disadvantaged schools. The most financially advantaged schools in the state are finding trouble finding maths teachers, science teachers, teachers in digital technology, which puts the most isolated and disadvantaged schools at even more of a disadvantage as comes to bear. And when you look at teacher shortage numbers, they often conceal the real problem, which is around a qualified teacher in the classroom. And so many of our students are going through high school without teachers who are qualified in mathematics, who've retrained across. There's a myriad of PE teachers teaching mathematics. And what we're seeing at the University of Sydney is the consequence of that. We are one of the few universities in the country that still has quite rigorous mathematics prerequisite levels. What we're finding is fewer students doing more advanced mathematics, and certainly far fewer students from SES disadvantaged areas doing mathematics. So when we are looking to increase the number of students who can come in from disadvantaged schools, and we recognise that we'll do some adjustments to ATAR levels, the number of students who are actually meeting the maths prerequisite and getting our adjusted ATAR level is smaller and smaller and smaller. So pipeline challenges there. The other pipeline challenge, of course, is around gender. And just as Mary has identified, well, where will the growth come from for those who need to come to university? The underrepresented group is low SES group. The underrepresented group in STEM is female students. And again, big pipeline effect. When I was at the department, there'd be a lot of drama around subject selection of girls in high school. But I think what you could really recognise is these patterns and mindsets around whether I'm a maths person, whether I'm interested in STEM. These aren't emerging when girls are 15 or 16. They're often embedded back in primary schools, and back in primary schools where you may have teachers themselves who may not have done maths and been maths avoiders and are exercising their discretion to move classroom activity away from the important foundational areas to areas that are more comforting and engaging. Now, at the University of Sydney, we have 32% of our students in engineering are female, but we reckon, which is the highest, I think, in the country. And it's a broad faculty, so there might well be areas that kind of reinforce that number when you do a like-for-like comparison. But again, what is our pathway program to identify talent? And you've got to actually be looking at that trajectory all the way back into primary school in order to address that. Just a couple of other quick insights. I think we still struggle on getting this pipeline right for the way we treat vocational education subjects in high school. The Wyndham scheme created the New South Wales High School Certificate, and it was first run in 1967 when 20% of students stayed on to do the HSC, and the HSC was designed for university selection, university pathway. And it was an academic flow for the most academically able students. Now 80% of students stay on to do the HSC. The HSC, though, still is overwhelmingly influenced by the way it looked back in 1967. And part of the harshness of that is how vocational education subjects are treated by the HSC and what we think of vocational education processes. And if you look at particularly European countries that are very good at this, they don't think about vocational education programs for the less academically able. They think of vocational education programs as being strong examples of applied learning. And there's absolutely no reason at all why your most mathematically gifted students should not be able to do vocational education courses that are strongly linked to applied real-life learning that are handsomely treated by the HSC and by the ATAR accreditation system. And we've got nothing to show for 50 years of that. Just finally, I think as I've seen the data, Australian graduates with engineering degrees represents about 10% of the cohort that we are graduating now, about half the percentage that you'd see in Japan or Germany and other countries. I think every way we look at it at the university, students with skills in engineering are going to be in demand because of the increasing multidisciplinary nature of the workplace and the multidisciplinary nature of research. As we build a big new biomedical accelerator at the University of Sydney, which is attempting to speed up the development of drugs, devices and diagnostics to cure incurable diseases, engineers are absolutely a central part of that, as they are in many other parts of the university. But I suspect engineering faculties have been underinvested, certainly as far as infrastructure is concerned. When I came back to the University of Sydney, having been away for a long period of time, there were spectacular developments all over the campus. The engineering faculty looked remarkably similar to what I remembered back in the mid-80s. And again, the ability, if universities were able to enrol more students, that goes to CSP places, but able to afford the infrastructure that is needed to support those students, that's another dilemma we've got to resolve.
So much to unpick. One of the things you touched on towards the end that has been yet another bee in my bonnet, ATAR. How the ATAR system skews people's choices, either as individuals or as schools, and how they promote certain directions to kids. And an example is geology. We talked earlier about geology departments closing down. To do geology, geography is a great place to start. It's so undervalued in the ATAR system. I know when my son was going through HSC, the number of kids who were great and loved geography just went, well, there's no point because it's just going to completely stuff up my ATAR, so I won't do it. So so that's one sort of really structural thing that we could address tomorrow. We could actually look at the ATAR and how it's skewing the decisions of children. Do I take the harder maths course, which I'd love to do, but I won't do so well, and against the cohort, and all of these ridiculous things that come into the decision making. So I throw it to Mary and to everybody else in this field. How,
the ATAR bunny.
How do we change that paradigm so that it doesn't have undue consequences and unforeseen consequences?
So let me start, but this is an issue that the New South Wales Vice-Chancellors are wrestling with kind of constantly. I mean, the ATAR is designed to help universities select students and to, in a sense, to put them on a level playing field. There is a big black box that explains how ATAR works and operates, and Barney has a PhD in maths, so he'll explain to you that if you want that kind of detail. Yeah. But you know, I think the dominance of the ATAR and the challenge of the ATAR and the scaling questions that you reflect on now have become amplified with 80% of the students doing it rather than 20% of the students doing it. It used to work better when students were operating on a direct academic stream. But you do need to be able to compare cohorts and levels of difficulties across different subjects. I think one of the interesting questions, and it goes to SES questions and fairness, There are many people who are highly critical of the ATAR in ways that you've articulated. I was interested to find supporters of it in places I didn't expect. Principals of schools in very low SES backgrounds. Because they said once you move away from the number is the number and you attempt to make that number as fair as possible, and you go to other things like, what does your portfolio look like? What's the extracurricular activities you've been doing? What are the enrichment processes and community service activities you operate under, which is very much the hallmark of the American system? Then they say that just skews the process even more towards socioeconomically advantaged students. And you look at the Harvard intake, they still take an extraordinary percentage of students from the top 1%, because all of those selection criteria skew towards those who have the money to be able to pave the way to make it happen. I think there are subjects. I think economics is one, and geography is another. There are others that have kind of fallen out of favour, and the smaller those cohorts are, the more the stronger students in those areas are punished. I think there is still an argument, particularly around mathematics, that if you can pull it off at the highest level, the scaling process still works for you. But I think what you can see, and I think what we can see in numbers of schools, is the lack of confidence in the teaching staff that they would be able to deliver students to perform at the highest level. And students who might, well, they just do not have a critical mass of those students, so they push them all away. And one of the interesting things we did at the Department of Education was to link up high-performing schools and other schools, particularly in regional areas, many of whom had never prepared a student to deliver at, say, the top band level of the HSC. And so I think students are suffering with how it's working now.
I agree with Mark. It's interesting to go back on this question of ATAR reform just pre-COVID. And this is not an excuse in a way, but it's recognising there was actually a lot of work going on to address some of the fundamental challenges that Mark's alluding to, particularly around mathematics, but there are other disciplines, economics, geography might be in that category as well. There was some national comparison work going on to see, well, what are other states doing to try and reform their ATAR systems so that we start to encourage students to move into higher level mathematics, not to move away from it, to find ways to, and I think Victoria had been doing some really interesting things. COVID hit and everything went into on the back burner. We haven't really re-engaged that topic, but we should. And I agree with you. It can't be solved tomorrow, though. Not simply because tomorrow is very busy with other things, but it's going to take a little bit of time to do it. That's the first point to make. Second point, again, Mark mentioned this earlier. We have begun to free up the HSC around the way in which vocational education and training subjects are counted towards an ATAR calculation. I think that's a really important move. The New South Wales VCs did that over the last couple of years, and I think it starts to move us in the right direction to recognise a broader set of applied learnings at Year 12. Final point I'd make is there is a lot of conversation amongst universities in New South Wales at the moment about pathways, entry pathways to university. The ATAR is one of them. Some of our universities see it as a very efficient method for doing that, and you certainly Sydney and UNSW, UTS and others see that benefit. Others have moved dramatically away from it, and that's creating its own challenge at the moment. New South Wales is the only state with a set of principles around early offers. And this year, early offers won't go out to students until September. This is a deliberate step by the New South Wales Vice-Chancellor's Committee to try and stop the deluge of early offers. You have states in Australia giving offers to Year 12 students in March for, in some cases, unconditional. And this is really beginning to distort the HSC around Australia. So it's a critical moment. I know that we've had briefings on it at the Accord panel level. The Higher Education Standards panel is concerned about it. I think the Education Ministers' Council later this year nationally will discuss it. I think it's an area that needs immediate and deep attention. We're touching on one element of it, but I think entry pathways, fairness, and it's not all about portfolios. That's one example of it. There are some other very effective non-ATAR based pathway programs now that recognise the results of the HSC rather than the ATAR and map that and correlate it to success in universities and find alternative ways of creating pathways. We need to look at the evidence base to support some of those programs. Are they working? I know in our case, we take a lot of students into our Diploma of Engineering program as an example of this. So they haven't reached our ATAR entry standard to engineering. We take them into an intensive alternative first year that goes beyond the normal 26 weeks. It's a 39-week program, highly intensive. We then, if they do well enough, they get into our second year engineering. We measure them at the end of second year engineering to see how they've gone against the cohort they came in against. They perform about 15 ATAR points beyond what they came in with. So you can scaffold learning, but Mark's absolutely right. We need fewer PE teachers teaching mathematics, and as a mathematician I feel this deeply, in schools. We've got to solve all of these complex problems or we will not move this dial. ATAR reform won't help us if we don't address this comprehensively. I'm sure Vicky might
Yeah,
add to
Vicky, of course, having grown up in the US system, but just quickly on the maths ones, I've got a crazy idea. For every mathematician that NAB steals out of our pool, they should pay the same price for a maths teacher in our school system. Because who wouldn't go to NAB rather, or any of the banks or finance houses, rather than carry on as a teacher, make them pay for it.
Yes. So, look, I think that the pathway issues is going to return, and especially about, the whole discussion about, do we invest some of the CSP places in enabling, pathways. And I think this is going to be important for if we really want to raise, especially the low SES and Indigenous population. There is no other way except to really build those pipelines, larger, and also have an ability to, do that uplift. Now, whether or not you can do a real uplift in mathematics for a bridging course, but even we were, having a discussion about how we reach deeper, that university collaborate with schools, and we have a program at university, the Wang program, about, us collaborating with schools who do not have enough STEM teachers, who do not have maths or physics, to give them the critical mass to bring that up. And the same outreach we've also done when I was in Queensland. And that is, as I said, we can't change necessarily the school system, but as universities, that's what I'm saying, we can be collaborators. And as I say, hopefully also, as I say, we are facilitating, bring industry to be as a part of that tripartite engagement with schools. So saying, if you want my 5,000 engineering graduates on the other side, you need to help us build that, invest in helping us with uplifting the skill sets in the schools.
Just on the NAB levy question, I think, yeah, I think it's very challenging when you look at the demographics. I think fewer and fewer 18-year-olds are deciding after 13 years of schooling, another 50 years in school sounds like a good career to them. We're almost maxed out, and one of the things we discovered is that in teaching, they're very thin markets. There isn't a vice chancellor in the country who isn't concerned about the volume of potential students applying to do education. I think it's a very rich area for mid-career recruitment. And one of the things we looked at in our review, and Barney's and numbers of other universities are experimenting with this, is how can you fast-track experienced people with deep disciplinary expertise in areas like mathematics. So they pretty quickly can get in the classroom, they're pretty quickly earning, and we're tapping into their expertise. And I did run into numbers of people in the department who had come out of Big Four consultancy firms, they'd come out of Telstra, they'd come out of law firms. And in a sense, they often took a redundancy package and used that to pivot into teaching, where they thought this could be a pretty satisfactory second half of the career. And I think that's the richest market that we need to tap. We should have the Department of Education outside the PwC building now.
Yeah, definitely. Can I just, one element you might like to comment on, Mark, that I think it's a great idea, the mid-career opportunity, and I know there are programs. I think Newcastle's just announced an innovative shorter program that provides some paid employment quickly. I know that's a concern for many people transitioning across from one career into another, but I think the biggest challenge is not so much encouraging that group into teacher education and into education. It's to support them when they're in the classroom. And your report, I think, touched on this, because classroom management issues, professional development, ongoing learning, and in some cases they may have a discipline background that's relevant, but they're a long way from how that's applied in the classroom.
Yeah, and so one of the things I was saying to education ministers, I think you almost need to look at a start date minus 3 years plus 3 years. You need more intensive coaching and mentoring and support, better prac teaching whilst people are studying teachers. But education, it's really quite perverse how it works. You know, when you graduate as a medical student, you then become an intern. The learning continues and structured very much around. What often happens in education is you're one of the last teachers recruited to that school. You're the one who's teaching Year 9 mathematics at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. You often get the most challenging classes in the most isolated areas with very little support. Yeah, and increasingly, you don't have a permanent job. So to think about how you're layering in coaching, mentoring, and support when you arrive, I think, to build resilience, and also, as we've recommended, to structure the initial teacher education program around the things that matter most: how students learn, effective teaching methods with a focus on literacy and numeracy, strong classroom management skills. You get those things right, students are more likely to graduate, more likely to be resilient once they start, and more likely to spend a career in teaching. I think we know what works best. The challenge is going to be doing that.
Yeah, and if we want maths qualified people in front of maths classrooms, then, and coming out of mid-career, Mark, we have to do all of those things, particularly for them in the classroom. Otherwise, they'll be in the profession for 2 years and they'll drop out, and that's what we have to avoid.
I'm going to go back to one of the other topics we were briefly touched on, and that's the kind of foundations or pathways programs. I used to be on the board of and director and chair for some time of InSearch, in terms of a really successful, both for bringing international students up to speed to get into mainstream university courses, but very importantly also, and I think understood, how many Australian students also do that when their HSC and ATAR have not quite come up to scratch. So rather than built in, as you were talking about, it's kind of very slightly to one side. But maybe you'd like to talk about some of those other foundations and pathways.
Yes, thanks. So you mentioned, which is the equivalent of UTS College. It's a foundation year, and that is one opportunity. The other opportunities we've had is U2 Uni, which is, I think, high-level pastoral care for cohorts of students who do not have the original ATAR to get in. And one of the balancing act is, they really do see, start to perform, be very successful. But I think one of our challenges is that scale issue, that if we want to achieve the numbers that of low SE, so we were looking and say, well, if we double or triple or quadruple, what is the level of that kind of intensive intervention we can do? Or are there better ways that we can assess their needs and provide, the platform for support? So I think this is a significant question we need to know, that there are multiple ways of transitioning different types of cohort of students, but I think the challenges for university is looking at is like, if we want to go to intensive intervention, then we need to think about then, can we do that really at scale? And if it's not at scale, what are more efficient ways of doing that?
I mean, just to add to what Vicky says, I think it picks up a big theme in the interim report around how do we bring more equity students in, whether they're low SES or from other equity groups. One thing that I found particularly challenging, as from the panel perspective, I'm sure Mary would support this, is how complex it is to provide the right framework to support not just access and participation for equity groups, but success in a timely way. And it goes to a whole range of issues. It's not simply how we scaffold the learning of those students to ensure they have the added support they require because of an educationally disadvantaged background. It's how do they actually support themselves while they're studying. So there's cost of living issues. We're hearing a lot about placement poverty. Students in particularly low SES students and others how do they actually get out to do a placement if it means they lose their part-time job, they have to move location? How do we get over the placement poverty issue? And there are actually some inherent challenges in the income contingent loan arrangements that fund our sector that also actually mitigate against equity groups. So there's a lot to resolve when you come to addressing this issue that the Accord panel has to respond to. We have to lift participation, and it's partly pathway programs, it's partly enabling, it's partly enhanced support for those students. The New Start program at UTS is a great example of that, but it is a multifaceted and complex problem, and there's no doubt, though, it's one we have to crack for the reasons that all of us are in this room. We want more engineers. So let's face it, if we want more engineers and we want diversity in our engineering cohorts, then we have got to be able to scaffold and support the learning for equity students into higher education.
And now, yet another topic that I think would be really interesting to spend a few minutes before I open it up to the floor. In Mary's report, Barney, you also mentioned the micro-credentialing. I was in WA recently. You would know the boom and bust cycle of the mining industry means that mining engineers, they're all working in the mining industry and suddenly they're redundant. But we don't want them to leave forever because the boom will come back and we need to be able to keep them cycling within various areas of engineering. So how do we reskill them in other areas of engineering so they're not lost to the sector altogether, but also others who've started off as one kind of engineer and actually see this is much more interesting over here once they've done some time in their career. And I understand, Mark, also that the group of 8 have talked about a unified engineering council, and I don't know if that's an area where this topic would be part of. So
Maybe if I can jump
Chat
in,
away.
and then Mark can. I'll definitely not talk for the GO8. I think Mark should do that.
I'll leave that.
Look, I think it's a really interesting topic globally at the moment is flexible, stackable, modular, however you want to describe them, new credentials. They're not MOOCs, they're not massive online open courses, open learning opportunities. These are a very different stackable and they're credentialed. And they are very much an opportunity for upskilling and reskilling. I think we all recognise the opportunity of that. What's lacking is an appropriate structure for micro-credentials at the national level. The government has provided a bit of guidance around it, but it's a very broad set of guidelines. And I think from a perspective of my university and what we want to do, we need more structure. I think one of the really interesting things happening relevant to engineering in this room, there are 2 institutes of applied technology that are now operational in New South Wales. The first one, the IAT Digital, is a UTS, Macquarie, TAFE New South Wales initiative, very much about micro skills, micro credentials. Without stealing your thunder, Vicky, it's got very good numbers. Yes. You know, you've got 10, 11, 12, 13,000 people or more now doing micro skills, recognising in the digital space great facilities at Meadowbank, at TAFE New South Wales at Meadowbank, but really a new opportunity to engage in uplifting skills, not just for young people who are coming out of school, but for others, for mature age people who want to shift career. So that's operational. The IAT Construction Innovation and Multi-Trades is now operational at Kingswood with Western Sydney and a big industry partner. The thing about these IATs as an idea that came out of the Gonski-Shergold report on tertiary education in New South Wales is they involve universities, TAFE and industry and business. It's got to be all 3. It's got to be a tripartite commitment, and it's got to address not just okay, how do we develop some micro-credentials for upskilling? How do we involve the industry partner in work integrated learning and placements? How do we stack this up into a new degree structure? And I must say, New South Wales has led the way in trying to give this structure. And then we start to see it is attractive to students. It's being subsidised at the moment. That's a big challenge for the Accord, I think, for us, Mary, to think about, well, what sort of new models of income contingent loans or Commonwealth subsidy are going to be needed with maybe industry support as well. We shouldn't leave them out of the equation. They should be here or off the hook in any way. NAB definitely not off the hook after today, because there's a big role for them to play in helping to support this future. I think it's an exciting area of development for higher education. Like most new ideas, it tends to start in a slightly chaotic way. But I think there's a really interesting report that came out just a few weeks ago on global trends in micro-credentials, and that really illustrates everyone's looking at it, New Zealand, Europe, Australia, the US less so. How do we make them work? How do we make the language communicatable across international boundaries? It's a really interesting area.
No, thanks, Barney, for stealing my thunder, but but thank you for the compliment. And I think that does point out that the overarching framework and one of the issues we have is, there's been a lot of pilot programs, and they come and they go, so we get a lot of interest, and then it stops. So I think it's one of the issues that we're particularly putting in the court is thinking about how do you move that to BAU and be sure that there is a sustained system there. And I like the comment about international recognition, because that's come up to me, say, how attractive would that be if we set the standard where international students would be coming here to upskill, to cross-skill? That would be an entirely different, cohort of students that we may never have tapped into. But how do we make our credentials recognizable internationally as well as nationally?
So I'd agree with all that, and how you create a meaningful credential, the way that universities and TAFE have been able to do so for generations. I think that's part of the challenge. Just two further insights. I think, at graduation ceremonies at Sydney now, we just tell the students, we used to think of this as a finishing line. Now it's just a milestone. They need to understand they'll be learning for the rest of their careers, and we want to be their partner in that learning. The challenge for us is, are we nimble enough to be able to respond quickly to those kinds of challenges? Back earlier in my career, I worked in newspapers and in broadcasting, and at times I'd be brought in to talk to Vice-Chancellors about lessons from the media about what digital disruption can do. And as I sit and look at our numbers, and I think our numbers are the same as everyone else's, there's this interesting contradiction here. The area we have greatest softness is mid-career master's programs, the kinds of degrees that people used to do to enhance their careers and to kick on after their undergraduate degree, and you'd go and get a master's by coursework. Probably didn't want to do a PhD, but that's what you'd then do. That's where we're seeing softness, just at the time as we recognise that lifelong learning and keeping on top of a fast-changing world is more important than ever, which says that many master's degrees by coursework are too broad, too non-specific to immediate career challenges, too generic, and that the only people who are offering training now isn't clearly just the universities or the vocational education sector. There are a myriad of new providers who are in that marketplace of highly variable quality. And I think part of our question is, at a university, can we be good partners, as the other speakers have alluded to, can we be good partners with industry, good partners with industry groups, recognise that we are bringing to the table ways and insights of structuring learning and assessment that's meaningful, but there'll be specific industry-linked or disciplinary-linked expertise that now will fall strongly outside the institution as well as being held inside the institution, and will be most meaningful if you can partner. And I see a totally different array of programs offered under the university banner in partnership, far shorter, far more focused than we've ever seen before. And I think the risk is, unless we are agile enough to be able to engage that, others will come in and dominate that space and do it for us.
We could talk forever amongst ourselves, but I'm quite sure there are some burning questions from the floor. No, fine, we'll talk. George.
Thanks, Catherine. There's been a lot of focus on the pipeline issues and schools, and I think that's really, really important. But one issue that the panel hasn't touched on yet is teacher quality. I know there's teacher availability in STEM and all that sort of thing. But when it comes to teacher quality, we don't do what other jurisdictions around the world do. I mean, they identify the top 20% of teachers and reward them appropriately. And equally important, they identify the bottom 20% of teachers, and they do something about them. They do something about helping them improve their classroom performance. They get the top teachers to actually sit in the classrooms of underperforming teachers to assist them in improving their game. Now, I know there are a lot of industrial implications in doing that, but is it just too hard for us to look at that problem?
I don't think it's too hard. I think it is complex. One of the things that we did when I was at the department was we looked at, I think we're in an era now where you get rich data, and rich data gives insights into performance. What we created through 2,200 schools in New South Wales was profiles of schools that were statistically similar. SES background of the students, non-English speaking backgrounds, in the area of diversity, and we'd come up with a cluster of 40, and then would analyse the results of those 40 schools on assessments like NAPLAN and PISA, and other issues like attendance and behaviour issues and the like. And what you could see is that despite severe areas of disadvantage, there were schools that could overcome that. There were schools that did exceptionally well. And so what we would then do is to try and deconstruct what are those schools doing well, and how do you apply those lessons to the other schools in the cohort, and put a strategy down for a pathway for improvement for every school in the state, and clear guidelines and targets to work at. Now, it astonished me a bit that the Education Department had been going for 100 years before it got round to this, but the data made it easier to have the conversation and demonstrate that it could be done. I think part of the challenge we've got in the school system now is that given the teacher shortages, given the industrial complexity we've been dealing with, given the COVID disruption, overwhelmingly educators I speak to are exhausted and overwhelmed by the challenge that they face. And I think one of the challenges around how certainly the first rollout of Gonski money happened was that schools got a lot more cash but had much less support available to them. And I'm not sure that balance has operated well. But I think we can have insights to have expectations around what good performance looks like. You can have more targeted support, including opening classroom doors and sitting in the classrooms and deliver support. And I think, and there's great examples around the country of what best practice looks like that I see education ministers around the country embracing with some level of intensity.
Thanks, Vicky. I think something Vicky touched on earlier, I think, is important in this too, is the way universities are working with schools. And it's not simply that our student teachers go out and spend time on practical placements. That's one part of the relationship. I think we're seeing deeper relationships between universities and schools, centres of excellence, centres of teaching excellence being developed in schools, so that you have much more of a clustering of our students in those schools, and then we do the professional development support for the teachers. So it's about uplifting teacher quality at the same time as providing outstanding supervision of our students, and doing it in a very similar way to what we do with hospitals and the way we train our medical students, and seeing that as a better model to develop not just our students and their capabilities, but the quality of the teaching profession around them. There's still more to do, I think, though. We don't get it quite right the way we supervise students when they're on practical placements in schools. I think there's more work to be done on that, and we shouldn't underestimate the benefit to teachers from that who are doing the supervision, because their professional development is a crucial part of it. So I agree with Mark. It's a complex and challenging area, and I think every university is focused on it who has an education faculty. But the challenge is our education faculties are in long-term decline. So we have to do a lot to actually bring those student numbers back, so we actually have a pipeline of teachers coming through.
Maybe we should have engineering students, not teaching students, but engineering students go out to those schools and support.
Can I say that a couple of my former colleagues who were PhD students, postdocs actually, they actually changed careers and became high school teachers, and that was they found it really rewarding. So that may be something we might want to think about, like adult and alternative pathways, career pathways for PhD trained cohorts as well, in chemistry and engineering.
Peter, we've got 5 minutes. Yeah. Oh, 2 questions, then one, and then Peter. Somebody's got the mic already, Peter.
Good morning. In the keynote earlier today, we heard about the criticality of connecting students meaningfully to workplace, to work integrated learning. I'm curious about your thoughts on the role of universities in this and any insights or programs you might have in your universities that connect students to workplace.
We just don't have enough time to do this topic because it is a huge issue. It's one of the reasons I'm sure Mary spoke this morning about why we have the word accord in the title of the review going on of higher education in Australia, because one of the key recommendations from the review will be to have an accord. That is a process whereby business, industry, universities, government, unions come together to start grappling with some of the challenges that we're facing. We're talking about skill shortages, STEM education, engineering crisis, you name it. We need to actually be in the room with industry to work on things like enhancing work integrated learning at scale and to address issues like placement poverty. I think one of the best meetings that Mary and I attended during the consultation process was convened by the BCA. So it was a business council. Jennifer Westacott chaired it, and it was with a whole lot of industry people talking about with university representation, talking about the challenges of work integrated learning and co-design of curriculum and workforce challenges and so on. The problem is that was about the first time that conversation had happened for a long time. So we need to be better at the dialogue, more regular, and that'll help us to solve some of the challenges of will.
I might just add that, what we term work integrated learning can take a lot of different forms. So you conventionally think about it as an internship, but it also might mean that you bring industry people in to have industry focused projects, industry informed, curriculum assessment type, for example, a design project with clients as industry. So I think that it can take into all different types of what work integrated learning can be, and we can be quite flexible about that and thinking about what gives a better outcome for the student experience at the universities, and how those soft skill preparations get folded into that experience. It's not just about can you run that next widget, in the lab. It's about all that career and soft skill building along that pathway.
Well, hopefully Peter's question's not going to open a vast can of worms that we need another hour for.
I'll be quick.
We could be here all day.
I'll make it very easy, thank you. Firstly, it's great. I'm enjoying today, and I like listening to these three speakers put up these perspectives, but they're challenges. So my point will be we need to act on two things at least that you three have put forward. One is, why is Japan doing double the graduation ratio as Australia? Is it culture? Is it STEM? Is it there's something that we ought to understand from that and fix it, because that's a part of the solution to solve the crisis. The second one is the ATAR question that you brought up. That gerrymander, if that's the right word, I think it is, has to be fixed, and that has to be national, and it needs a fixed. Mary, I guess it comes back maybe into your... Anyway, it's an important one to fix. Thank you.
We are out of time.
We agree, by the way.
Yes, everyone's nodding on this panel. One quick last word from any of you, if you want to just leave with one last thought for this audience.
One last thought. Interesting time. We're coming up to a state budget in New South Wales. And one thing we need to see is a momentum with R&D investment. You can't change the New South Wales economy if you don't invest in R&D with universities. The Advanced Manufacturing Research Facility, the new RNA training facility. I do give credit to Hugh and the huge amount of work that's gone on there. We all need, I think, to be engaged with government about the opportunities that investment by the state government, let alone what might come out of the Accord around R&D. So I'd put that high on the list for ATSE to think about, because I think it's a tough budget coming, but we need to talk to government about what happens over the next 3 years.
can I say Tech Central, Tech Central, Tech Central? But no, I think we do recognize the complexity of the next couple of years. We also recognize there's unlikely to be a lot more money for this area, so we will have to hunker down and look at how we best leverage the innovations we have and nurture them so that we have that sustained momentum. And ATSE Engineering Australia, we got to get our industry partner to advocate for us, really get out there and say, it's not university asking for more money. We do want more money, but we need your support because we cannot deliver what you want from us otherwise.
We haven't talked about them in much depth today, but just international students as part of the tremendous opportunity that exists for us here. As Minister Clare said at the National Press Club, this is the most valuable export industry Australia has that we don't grow or dig up out of the ground. We perform tremendously well. We have 7 engineering faculties in the global top 100. But it's still challenging for some international students to get here through visa slowness or restrictions. Many international students feel that they don't have the springboard to advance their career in Australia after graduation because they feel they've been denied the work experience opportunities that would be particularly valuable to them. And as we look at the most significant growth market for international students over the decade ahead will be India. And students out of India, in contrast to other markets, particularly China, are making a very focused calculation on the value of a return on this very significant investment they make to be an international student. So how do we prioritise providing them the professional experience that often domestic students get, first step into the workforce, and creating opportunities where if they want to, they could help alleviate some of the very significant skill shortages we have rather than taking a plane back home.
Fantastic. Will you all please join me in thanking our wonderful panel?